Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. Today's program is interactive, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions later in the program by using the 800 number or email address appearing on your screen. We hope to hear from you during the broadcast. I'm Maria Salvadore, your moderator for today's program. With us is Patricia McKissack, compelling storyteller and award-winning writer. Ms. McKissack uses stories from her own background and draws on her family's stories to tell riveting tales with universal appeal. Additionally, Ms. McKissack finds the stories in history. She deftly weaves factual information throughout her works of fiction and presents informational books as only a storyteller could. As we find out more about Ms. McKissack's sources, we'll take a look at different ways stories are told, what techniques are available for different kinds of storytelling, and learn what happens to stories once they've been shared. Welcome, Ms. McKissack.
Thank you.
Color Me Dark, The Diary of Nellie Lee Love, The Great Migration North, is a fictionalized account of a family that moves from Tennessee to Chicago during a time of great turmoil and change in the United States. It's based in the history of the United States, revealed through, as I said, the fictionalized diary of Nellie Lee Love. Ms. McKissack, tell us a little bit more about the story.
Well, Nellie Lee's story is a story that actually originated in my family. My grandfather left Nashville, Tennessee, and migrated to Chicago to be with his brother. He was about 19 years old, and it happened at the same time Chicago had the Great Chicago Riot. And so he left there and went back to St. Louis. So I knew that story, and it interested me. What happened? What was going on in 1919? And as I explored, Nellie Lee, the Loves are very much like a lot of Southerners who left the South looking for better opportunity for their children in education and for jobs and for housing. Because in the rural South at that time, in 1919, it was very, very segregated. Very segregated. And also the Klan had reorganized at that time in Georgia, and it was just a reign of terror at that time. People were being hanged, burned, their houses and businesses were burned. And so the soldiers who were returning from World War I decided that we're not going to put up with this. And so they packed up their families and moved to the north, to the industrial north, where there was work. And so the Loves were not just a single story, but a story about many African Americans who were at the beginning of the Great Migration that went from 1919 to 1945.
Well, you write Nellie Lee's story from the perspective of a diary. Yes. And my guess is that a lot of readers think that Nellie Lee was real. Was she?
Well, yes and no. She was real in that I used the women in my family to model Nellie Lee and Irma Jean. In fact, my mother's name is Irma, and my aunt's name is Nellie Lee. And when I told my mother I was going to write this book, her name is Irma, and she said, well, I hope you don't use Lucille, because that's her middle name. And I said, well, why, Mom? And she said, well, I've never liked that name. I like my name Irma, okay, but I didn't like Lucille. And she said, so I hope you use something else. I said, well, what would you like if you could name yourself? And she said, I always liked Irma Jean. So I named my character Irma Jean so I could give my mother her wish to have a different name. And then, of course, Nellie Lee is my aunt. But when we look at those girls, they're very much like my sister and me. They're very much like my grandmother and her sister, and then my great-grandmother and her sister. There were two sisters for 4 generations in my family, and so I pulled from the stories that I had heard about them and then my own experiences to create Nellie Lee and Irma Jean.
Well, you write a diary. How do you become so involved to write from this character's point of view so that we believe you when we read it?
Well, I'm a lot like I am Nellie Lee in a lot of ways. I had some of her same experiences, and I enjoyed doing some of the same things that she did. In fact, in our family, there were the two of us, my sister Sarah and me, and they called us the pretty one and the smart one. And my sister was the pretty one, and I was the smart one. Many years later, we said, well, you know, I wanted to be pretty. And my sister said, well, I wanted to be smart. And that kind of tells you a little bit about the time frame. What we're talking about here, women couldn't be pretty and smart. And that's kind of ridiculous now, but in those days they couldn't. And I think you noticed in the book there were a lot of things that women could not do. For an example, the teacher, you couldn't teach and be married at that time. There are a lot of little things that I brought in like that told us where we were as far as the development of women's rights and women's contributions to this nation. Yeah.
Well, one girl was fair-skinned,
yes,
and the other was dark-skinned.
Yes.
It had a profound impact on them in the story.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, in most African American families, you have mixtures of skin complexions from very, very fair to very, very dark. And in one family, you'll find somebody very, very dark and maybe a brother or a sister or an uncle who's very, very dark. So that was just common knowledge in most African American families. But this tension between dark-skinned, light-skinned people actually originated during slavery time. Usually the fair-skinned slaves were the children of the master by a slave woman, and they were allowed to live in the big house very often and to work in the big house. The darker slaves were then sent to the fields. After the Civil War, some of the house slaves believed that they were somehow better off than those who had worked in the fields. And there was a great deal of resentment felt by those who had been the field slaves. And that was carried through well into the 20th century. And so in the 1919, it was at its peak, where people actually believed that being fair-skinned gave you a better opportunity to be successful because you looked more white, and in more white you were more acceptable. It took until the 1960s for that to be challenged, and when we all accepted the fact that we are all black people and proud of no matter what skin color, we are all in this together.
Well, Nellie Lee writes about it in one of her entries.
Yes, she does, and I'd like to share that with you. It's how her father felt about this whole business of skin complexion, and it was how our family felt about it. Again, writing out of my own experiences. Some people are so color-struck, they think being light-skinned is better than being dark. Mama says that's nonsense, and I think so too. I love it when Mama tells about her grandmother, Lizzie Palmer. She had been a slave. After the war, because she was so light-skinned, many people thought she was white. But when people asked Lizzie Palmer if she was white, she'd always answer, "No, color me dark." Papa won't stand for color talk either. He says a colored family is like a beautiful bouquet of flowers, all different colors, sizes, and shapes, but each one just as beautiful in his or her own way. We need only to look at Daddy's side of the family to see that he's telling us the truth. The Love family is just like the bouquet Daddy described.
Well, let's talk a little more about the Love family. Tell us, start with Freeman.
Well, Freeman, I modeled after my husband's father. There's a wonderful picture of him, and his face is so strong, and I said, that's my Freeman. And I named him Freeman, obviously, free man, a free man. And that's something my grandmother would have done. She believed in freedom so much.
What about John Willis?
Okay, John Willis. In our family, as in most families, we have those who might have what we call a mental challenge, or they may be depressed, or they may be retarded in some way. Well, in our family, we had such a person. There were no homes or institutions for people at that time in 1919. They were kept by their families. Some families chose to be ashamed of their loved ones and to hide them away. But in our family, we found what they were able to do and honored them in the best way we knew how by allowing them to contribute and make a contribution to the family. And so John Willis is that way. John Willis is slow, as he's called, but he is wonderful with his hands. And so he makes all of the caskets for the Love Funeral Home. He's contributing to the family, and so therefore he's not pushed aside or made fun of. He is part of the family.
Now, Aunt Fanny left Bradford Corners. Talk about her. She's an interesting character, too.
Yeah, Aunt Fanny, Ruth Ann, short for Fanny, short for Ruth Ann. She left home, as a lot of young people did leave home, to go to school or to get a job or to just get away from the terrible oppression of the segregated South. She went, of course, to New York. And I brought Fanny in because I wanted to talk about what was going on in New York in 1919, because it's the onset of what's called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was a period in which African Americans flourished artistically. The great poets came out of that period, and great musicians and artists. It was just a haven for creative people to go to New York. It's Harlem specifically, and that's why it's called the Harlem Renaissance. The Renaissance meaning a rebirth.
Well, that's been documented in photographs, and photographs are one way we learn about history and your family history. Yeah. But what else can you learn about history from photographs, and how else can you
use them for my research? Yeah, I use them all the time. Photographs, like they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and it really can be when you're researching. Of course, I use books to research. I try to go to tour houses. I try to go to museums and talk and interview people. But a picture can show me what the clothing was like, how people wore their hair, how people sit in the chair. If you look at the early pictures, they were so stiff, and people, husbands and wives, never touched each other. If you'll notice some of those pictures later on, people locked arms and hugged each other and put their hands on each other. In an earlier period, they didn't do that in a photograph. They were always very stiff and proper. You can learn about the toys. If a child is holding a toy, you can see what toys they had to play with. If it's a house scene, you can see the furniture and what the furniture looked like and what they had on the walls and whatever. I study a picture with a magnifying glass to see all that I can see out of that picture. But a picture without a story really is very flat and one-dimensional. You must have story to round it out. And so when a picture is most valuable to me is when it comes to me with a story.
We tend to think that history is removed from our experiences, but we make history each and every day in what we do and how we respond to the events around us. Other than photographs, how can we record that history, that story?
Oh, by all means. We have the means, the way to do it today that we didn't have just a generation ago. You have the video cam that makes it so easy just to record the senior members of your family. I encourage you to record your family members as they get older. Listen to their stories and what it was like to live during their time. I imagine some of your parents grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and so they have wonderful stories to tell about that time period because it was an exciting period too. That's one way. Keeping a journal of your own, just recording your feelings every day. I found a journal of mine that I had written some years back before I had grandchildren. And it was so interesting. I was even thinking about them at that time, writing to them saying, guess what I did today? And it was something exciting that I had done that I wanted to share and record so that my grandchildren will be able to see some of the exciting things that I've been privileged to do with these books. So keeping journals, that's a wonderful way of recording history, and we come back now and use them in our research. Lewis and Clark in St. Louis, where I'm from, we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition into the Louisiana Territory. And they left from St. Louis, going up the Missouri River. And it's from their journals that we learn a great deal about what they saw and what they heard and the smells and the sounds. And it's very interesting to check Lewis Meriwether's against Clark's, because they went the same place at the same time, but they saw different things. And that's important too in history, how it is interpreted. Because you'll read one book that interprets it one way, and another book, same time, same place, but they saw it differently. And so that's important too, to see different sides of the same story.
How did your family share its history and story, and did you get different points of view?
Oh, yes, we did. We had many different points of view in our family. Ours was storytelling. I came from a family of master storytellers. My grandfather told stories about little girls who could outsmart foxes and capture the wind. And they were about my brother, my sister, and me, Pat, Sarah, and Nolan. We thought we were just as brave and just as smart as little girls in his stories. But we later found out that my grandfather couldn't read. And so that was his way of sharing his world with us, was through the eye of the observer. Because he could not read, he had to be very careful about recording things visually and then giving them back to us verbally. My grandmother was the reader, and my mother was a reader and read Dunbar to me. So I grew up learning the rhythms of my favorite poet, who is Paul Laurence Dunbar, and Langston Hughes, and some of the other poets that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. So it's all full circle. It comes back to what helped and encouraged me to write this book. So much of my story is involved in it. Yeah.
And you have some letters that your grandparents wrote, don't you?
Yes, I do. I'd like to share one with you if I could.
Love to.
Oh, I love the fact that this is a letter that was written by my grandfather to my grandmother. This was both of their second marriage. He's really my step-grandfather, but we didn't use step. He was my grandfather. He was the only grandfather I ever knew, and I adored him. But I love to look for an example. This tells me a great deal. This was a special delivery, and it cost 12 cents. To send a regular letter was 3 cents. And they didn't have zip codes in those days. He's writing to my grandmother Sarah, and he's writing to her about they're getting married, and he's very concerned about the weather. We have the prediction of warmer weather, however, it has been cold. I hope we get some nice weather, but this is the time we can look for most anything. I am sure we will have to get the license, the marriage license, down in Tennessee, because the both of us will have to sign our names to it. I have already been asking at the City Hall in Kirkwood, but they just tell me to go and see some judge or justice of the peace, and they will tell me just what to do in your and my case. You see, it would be very easy if you and I were in the same place, but with you down there and me up here, that's different. How was your Thanksgiving? The old man, his father, and I spent the day working. We had for our turkey hog's head and kraut. Still, I have plenty of chickens, but no one to cook it for us. So we just made out with what we had. I was invited out to dinner, but I didn't want to leave the old man by himself, and I had some work to do around the house, getting ready for you to come. I just thought that was so dear to read a letter, and also it told me a lot about my grandfather. He was a very caring and loving man. And for him to stay at home with he was invited out to dinner, but he stayed at home with he called his father the old man, Papa Webb. Just love that.
It's interesting because you can see that the personality in the characters in the Love family in Color Me Dark. But you've also integrated real people and events into the story. Talk a little bit about some of the significant people who actually lived during this time and how they relate to Color Me Dark as historical fiction.
Yes. You are allowed to do that in writing historical fiction. And let me give you a definition of historical fiction. You take fictional characters and place them in a historic time period such as 1919. And then you can wrap real characters around the events and the action. The characters are fictional, but a lot of what they do is historically accurate. So what I did was to take the Love family. They belong to the NAACP, and Freeman gets to go to the NAACP annual conference, and there he gets to meet Ida B. Wells Barnett and James Weldon Johnson, who was a poet, but he was also the General Secretary of the NAACP, and he got to meet them and talk to them and to hear them speak, make their speeches. Ida B. Wells Barnett was, again, a migrant who left the South and went north when she married her husband, who was a newspaperman. Her work was to fight against lynchings, and she worked very hard to get a law passed that would make lynching a federal offense, a federal crime, the anti-lynching law. 1919 was a very pivotal year historically. It's called the Red Summer. And it was called the Red Summer because so many African American men and women and children were lynched by a terrorist organization such as the Ku Klux Klan. It was so bad, soldiers coming home from the war who had served this country and had even won medals, who had come home expecting to be welcomed, but instead came upon people who wanted them to get back in their place. And when they didn't do it, they were lynched because of it. Brutal, brutal lynchings. And so it was called the Red Summer. Ida B. Wells, James Weldon Johnson, and some of the other members of the NAACP fought very hard against that and finally got the law passed. Those who had been looking the other way could no longer look the other way. They had to engage and do something about this horrible atrocity that was going on, and they did. And they brought about change.
But things weren't all that different in Chicago.
Exactly. My point exactly. And the Loves were like so many others that came north expecting for it to be much better. And in many ways, it was. At least you didn't have the day-to-day pressure of someone kicking in your door and lynching you for some minor infraction. But there was violence there, and as long as you stayed within your community, you were okay. But when you went outside of your community, you sometimes ran into hostilities. And the hostilities weren't always from whites. Some of the hostilities came from blacks who resented these country hicks from coming out of the South and bringing their country and backward ways with them, their backward way of talking, using words like disremember and saying country phrases. They were embarrassed by that. And so they ran upon some hostile neighbors who had come earlier and had been what we call cityfied.
You've shown through various characters that you've created how events can change people and also how people can change events. You explore that idea in the historical fiction you write, but you also explore it in informational books. You find the story in history. Can you talk a little bit about some of your books that are based in fact?
Of course, Fred and I write fiction and nonfiction and historical fiction. Now, the nonfiction book, the straight nonfiction books that we write, Fred and I write together. Fred is my husband, Frederick McKissack, and we've been working together for 25 years. However, we've been married for 40. And I've even involved my sons in the process because researching is time-consuming. And Fred does all the research and I do the writing. Now, when I first started writing nonfiction, it was so dull. I can remember my first book was about Dunbar, and I've written about Sojourner Truth, and I've written about Black Diamond, the story of the Negro Baseball Leagues. And I just wrote facts. The date they were born, the date they graduated from high school, the date they got married, just dates and facts and figures. And I taught 8th grade English at the time, and I took my story back to them, and they said, "Who wrote this? Miss McKissack, it's terrible. It's so boring." And indeed it was, and I said I wrote it. I didn't want them to know that I had written mercifully. I had not put my name on it. But it was terrible. I had not included story. fiction, I write my fiction my nonfiction the same way I write my fiction. The 4 elements are character, action, setting, and idea. I write fiction that way, but I also write my nonfiction that way. Your character, you can't make up your character, you can't make up things they said and did, but I treat my character, I try to make that character whole, I try to get inside that character's head, just like I do my fiction. Setting, I always try to go to the place where I'm talking about. I went to Chicago when I was writing this book, and I looked through picture after picture of that time period at the library. I went to some of the old apartments that had been divided up into what they call kitchenettes. That's a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bath, and you shared the bathroom with everybody else on the hallway. I went to those places and tried to see and get a feel of what it felt like at that time. The action, that's what the story's about. And even though it's nonfiction, I try to find the action that can bring life to this skeleton of a character that we're given when you read an encyclopedia insert. That's just a skeleton. What you have to do as a writer when you're writing a longer piece is to mold it. An idea, that's the last part. When you close that book, what do you leave with? What are you left with? What ideas have you formulated from reading this book? The worst thing a book can tell you is to tell you what to think. You close the book and you have your own thoughts about what you learned from that book. Okay.
You, as a writer, use words, your intellect, and imagination to tell your story. But there are other ways of telling stories. An artist uses paints and pencils. A screenplay tells a story using actors, and they use many of the same techniques. Color Me Dark has been adapted for the stage by the Kennedy Center and Scholastic Entertainment Incorporated. Do you and the playwright or the screenplay writer have anything in common?
We have a lot in common, those 4 elements. Those 4 elements work for the stage play as well as they do the movie or the book, or when you're reading it by yourself. They're like apples and oranges, though. You can't compare one to the other. A play is very different, and a playwright approaches the story from a different point of view, and that's important, point of view. The playwright, I would no more tell a playwright how to interpret or to translate my story to the stage, because I do not have the skills of a playwright. They're very different from a novelist, very different from a screenwriter. It's like, let me give you an example. When we first moved to St. Louis, we heard people saying Missouri and Missouri. And I said, okay, what's the correct pronunciation of our new state? Is it Missouri? Is it Missouri? So I went to the library and I got a book about our state. And I found out that the Native Americans were called the Missouras. The Frenchman who founded St. Louis called it Missouri. So Missouri is the French pronunciation, Missouri is the Native American pronunciation. It's not a matter of one being right and the other being wrong, it's just different. And different is not a synonym for wrong. People will look at the play and say, oh, well, it's different from the book. Well, it's supposed to be. It's very different. But was the main elements there, character, action, setting, and idea? Did you come away with those elements intact? Then it works. Then the translation was good. The closer you can stay to those 4 elements when you translate or when you interpret a story, the better it is for those who are enjoying both. But we all know that the movie is always different from the book. You can do so much more in a book. And what I like about the book is that you can create your own characters in your head. You can put yourself there. You can actually be there when Jean gets her voice back. You can actually be there when Freeman comes home all excited. You can be there when they're slipping in and reading copies of the NAACP publishing arm called The Crisis Magazine, which was edited by W.B. Du Bois, by the way, which is one of those important characters of the time. So, Missouri, Missouri, the play, the book, they're both good. They're both good. They're different.
Well, that's interesting. Does a different interpretation ever introduce a new concept, or does it let you see your characters or your story in a different way?
Sometimes it does, and that's good too. That's very good. Sometimes when I write my picture books, this comes out more in a picture book. When I'm writing a picture book, I don't have an artist right there to say, now I want you to draw the girl to look this way, or I want the boy to look this way in the story, and this is the setting. The illustrator reads my words and allows my words to give him or her pictures, and then those pictures become the illustration of the book. So it's the artist's interpretation of my words. And I have to step away. Sometimes I never get to meet the illustrator of my book. Never know them. Yet they have taken something as intimate, something as close as words that come out of my life, out of my experience, and interpreted based on their lives and their experiences. And so it's wonderful to see how people interpret your words. I love it.
Well, you interpret words when you tell stories.
Exactly.
And the oral tradition is very old. It's been around longer than books or certainly television. And you're quite a storyteller yourself, Ms. McKissack. You've even written stories in the tradition of folk tales. Would you mind sharing one of those stories from the Dark 30 with us now?
Sure. The Dark 30, Southern Tales of the Supernatural. When I was growing up, we used to ride our bicycle like crazy to get home and get within the circle of light when my grandmother would start reading or telling her ghost stories. She would start at that hour, that it's that last half an hour before it gets all the way dark and the monsters come out. And we were believers in monsters, believe me. I was the first president and founder of Monster Watchers of America. So fast forward many years later, I used that as the title of my book, Southern Tales of the Supernatural, 10 original stories, and this is an original poem. It's called We're Organized. Part of our research brought us here to the Library of Congress, where we discovered the slave narratives. In the 1930s, writers were sent out to record the stories of former slaves. Those who had been in slavery were now well up in age and dying off, and they wanted to record and keep their stories, just like I'm suggesting that you keep the stories of your senior members of your family. Now, some of those stories are very chilling, some of them are very funny, and some of them are mysterious, like this one. You ask how we all got free, for Massa Lincoln signed the paper. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. Write this what I tell you, honey, write it. My lord's always a-writing. See, I'm Ajax, Massa's driver. I Ajax, master of the whip, got power. Hear it crack, pow. Hear it pop, pow. I can pluck a rose off its stem and never once disturb a petal. I can snap a moth in two while it's still on the wing. I can pick a fly off a mule's ear and never once ruffle a hair. Now one day Master say, Ajax, see that hornet's nest over there? Snatch it off the tree. I say, no, sir. No, sir, not that I can't do it, but some things just ain't wise to do. Master asks, well, why not? And I come back with, them hornets be trouble. They organized. See, I was trying to warn old master, but he never once listened. Tried to warn old master, but he never once listened. See, he a poor man and married money, and money turned him a fool, a mean fool. Master turned out Pappy Sims. Say he too old to pick cotton, no more use. Be careful, master. Beat Lily Mae, say she too lazy to breathe. Have mercy, master. Sell Sally away from her husband, Lee. See her no more. Watch out, master. Slap cook, no reason, just wanted to and did. Then must bring trouble to his own front door. He make a promise to free Carbella, the Congo woman, and he not do it. Big mistake, master. Just wouldn't heed a warning, no. He just wouldn't heed a warning. So when the lilacs bloom, that's in the spring, don't you know, Master be missing a button off his coat. Never mind, huh? Deep in the night, hear the music, long refrain, dancing, chanting, digging a grave with words, old words, powerful words. We pin Master's black button to a straw dial, and we hang it in the sycamore tree. Spinning, clapping, calling the names of the ancestors, old names, powerful names. 3 days dancing in the dark. 3 days chanting till dawn. Way in the night, Master hear the music in his head, and he hear the whispered words, Rashasha, Rashasha. And in a long refrain, he come screaming, Lord, 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 but it's too late. Come harvest time. That's in the fall, don't you know? Master be low, sick, near about wasted away. All the mean gone out of him now. Master called all of us to him. He freed the Congo woman. Yes, he did. He freed everybody and glad to be rid of us. Wrote out them free papers right now. Then he turned to me and he say, Ajax, get gone. Well, he didn't have to say it again. Now you ask me how we all got free before Master Lincoln signed the paper. Take heed, like them hornets, we organized.
Thank you.
Chilling.
Yeah. That poem actually started in a library.
It did.
And libraries have been very important to you. In fact, you gather stories when you go someplace special.
Yes.
And you even wrote a book about it.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that book and how it relates to Color Me Dark?
Yes, it is. It's very much a part of that story. Kind of grew out of Color Me Dark. It allowed me to put away some anger and to put away some things that happened to me in my childhood. I grew up in the south of Nashville, Tennessee in the 1950s, and it was a segregated town. I could not go to the museums. I could not go to the Grand Ole Opera. I could not go, or if we did, we had to go up into the balcony, the last 3 rows in the balcony, and that was called the Buzzard's Roost. And my grandfather said watermelons would bloom in January before he would let any of his family go sit in the Buzzard's Roost. But there was one place in Nashville when we couldn't go to hotels and restaurants or any place else we could go, and that was the public library. During the 50s, without sit-ins, without demonstrations, Nashville Public Library integrated all of its facilities. There was no trouble whatsoever. I've always said that those who would have complained and caused problems didn't use the library anyway. Because had they used the library, it would have expanded their minds. It would have extended their knowledge of the world and given them an opportunity to realize that we do not live in this one little corner of the world, that there's a larger world out there. That's what the library did for me. So what if I didn't get to go to the Grand Ole Opry? So what if I didn't get to eat in a restaurant or to go and stay in a hotel? I was given the privilege of going to the library. And that was the most important place of all. Because in my family, learning, knowledge, and knowing was number one. And that's the way the Love family was. My grandmother's maiden name was Love, and that's where I get that family name from. That's why I chose that name, the Love family. And my family was very much like that. My grandmother took me off to the library to get my library card, and I went often, and I went more often, and because I went often, I read more, and I read more, I read better, and when you read better, then you read success.
Well, now Ms. McKissack will be happy to answer questions from students in the audience and take your phone calls or emails. I'd like to invite our viewers to start calling in with questions. The phone number is 1-800-672-0067, or you can email the questions to pwinfo@aol.com. Let us hear from you. But before we take your questions, Ms. McKissack has several questions for the students in the audience.
I wrote down a few that I'd just like to know, get your feedback on. Who was your favorite character in Color Me Dark, and why?
Wait, right over here.
Oh, right
here.
Okay, right over here, yes.
Mine was Nellie Love, because she stuck up for her sisters, and like she liked everybody. She likes to get along with her friends.
Okay, I like that. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Right here.
Mine was Uncle Pace, because even though he was like the youngest of his siblings, all his siblings looked up to him, and like everyone in the story, even though he's not in it a lot, he keeps on popping up, and everyone respects him. Yeah.
He was well respected. My uncle died in Korea, and I knew how important, even though a person is no longer with you, they are kept alive through story again, the importance of story and telling stories about those who have passed on. My Uncle Buddy died in Korea, but we still to this day talk and tell Uncle Buddy stories because he was very dear to all of us. Yes.
My favorite character, he was Uncle Meese, because he was so mysterious and nobody knew like his job except like Nellie's dad and her mom only knew, but they wouldn't tell her.
Exactly.
What his job was, and they kept making her go away every time he came.
Yes, because he owned a nightclub. Oh, yeah, owning a nightclub. He was afraid that his mother would find out and she would not approve. Again, that's telling you a little bit about the times, what it was like, that owning a nightclub was not a thing that you would want your mother to know or have your little nieces to come and see. Yes.
I guess I don't have a favorite character or anything, but I think I just kind of like the Love family all around, because they kind of stood up for themselves and didn't back away with other people.
Yeah, they were a tight-knit family, and I wanted to show that because very often in literature you have families that squabble and fight. You see that model a lot in literature, where sisters are constantly at each other's throats. They love each other, but they're constantly fighting. I wanted to show a sister relationship where they loved each other and cared about each other, because that's the model I had in my family. And I said, what's wrong with that? How come we can't? It was us, it was them against an adversary, the two of them. They didn't need to fight each other. They had enough to fight without having to fight each other. Yes.
My favorite was Irma Jean, because she could talk if she wanted to, but she let those who wanted to talk, and she listened to what other people had to say.
Oh, yeah, she became a good listener, very good listener. You know, so often in a family, and in a large family, all people start talking all together, and you can't understand anything because everybody's talking, nobody's listening. So Irma Jean was that listener, and that was a good thing. Yes.
I like Nellie Lee because you made her relate to people my age, so we could understand her better than someone that's a lot younger or a lot older.
Interesting.
Thank you.
We have a call from Bradford, Pennsylvania. Caller, go ahead.
Hi. We are fourth graders watching the teleconference, and we had a question about the story Miranda and Brother Wynn. We wanted to know if you could maybe give us some background information on that story.
Of course, Mirandy and Brother Wind. Mirandy and Brother Wind is a story that again comes out of that family tradition. Remember we were talking about pictures? Well, there's a picture of my husband's grandmother, Miranda McKissack, and Moses McKissack, and they had just, they loved to do the cakewalk. And so I said, well, what's a cakewalk? Well, I knew what it was, but really, well, what was it back in their time? So that led me to research what a cakewalk was. And from that, I wrote Mirandy and Brother Wind, and it was illustrated by Jerry Pinkney, the same illustrator who illustrated Going Someplace Special. And her name was Miranda in the story, but I changed it to Mirandy because she sounds more like a wind dancer.
Interesting. We have an email from the Charles Center Charter School in Buffalo, New York. Okay. These are students of Miss Katie Wilson. One of the students asks, what musicians might have played in Uncle Meese's nightclub?
Oh my. Yeah, what musicians of that time? Well, you had the blues singers of that time. I don't think Bessie Smith came along at that time. You know, it escapes me when you ask something like that. It just went right out of my head. But that might be something you might want to research and find out, because I you know, just somebody right off the top of my head. I can't think.
Jazz?
Ma Rainey, I know, was singing at that time, and she was a blues singer. And
it's okay. It's a good research project.
Yeah,
for
it's
the
a good research project. I know some of the music. I know them so well, but it's just right out of my head.
Okay.
I wasn't thinking in that terms. Yeah.
We have another call.
Okay.
From St. Louis, Missouri this time.
Fantastic.
Caller, go ahead.
This is Thelma Brinker, and I wanted to know if these books are for children only or if they are adult books, and where can you get them?
They are for children, and you can get them in any bookstore in St. Louis, probably Barnes & Noble, and if you live downtown in downtown St. Louis, the Left Bank bookstore carries all of our books, and I love to go to an independent bookstore, and Left Bank is one of my favorites. Now that Paul's is no longer in existence, try Barnes & Noble or Left Bank.
And can I recommend the public library?
Oh, of
You're
course.
someplace special,
and when all else fails, go to the public library. Downtown Public Library has all of my books. I'm so pleased with the selections you have there.
We now have a question from one of our students right here. Go ahead.
I was wondering why you chose State Tennessee for the Loves to Start Off in.
Because that's where I grew up. That's what I know. Writers should write about things that they know about or can easily research and find it out. But I know Tennessee. I knew what it was like. I knew. Now, Bradford Corners is based on my little part of the world, Madison, Tennessee. And I named it Bradford Corners, but it was not. I didn't want to name a specific place because I didn't want a specific place to have to deal with this story in a contemporary times. I fictionalized the place so that there would not be a stigma attached to a specific little place in Nashville or in and around Nashville or Tennessee. But I did use Tennessee as my backdrop because I know the weather there. I know the smells, the sounds. I know what the housing looked like. I know what the community, how it was set up. So that's why I used Tennessee.
We have another caller from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how you got so inspired to write like this.
Could you repeat that?
I wanted to know what inspired you to write books like this.
What inspired you to write?
What inspired me to write books like this? A need. Before I was a writer, I was a teacher. I taught 8th grade English in the Kirkwood School District in St. Louis, a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. I also hold dual citizenship because part of my life I lived there with my grandparents in St. Louis as well, and in summers. And so I went back to teach there, and when I was teaching, I wanted to give my students some of the people that I had grown up knowing about, But when I went to the library, there weren't any books about them there. And so I said, well, you know, I can do that. I can write a book. Well, I'd never written a book before. I didn't know where to start. But once again, when you don't know something, the best place to go is to the library. So I went there and found a book that was titled How to Write a Children's Book. It isn't very imaginative, but it is accurate. And it gave me what I needed to know to write that first book. And practice makes perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm still practicing the art of writing, the craft of writing and the art of writing. It's a little bit of both. You have to learn how to craft, and then your artistic abilities come in, your creativity comes into play as well. So I was inspired because there was a need for books that told a different story. Remember that Missouri we talked about earlier? Well, my story may be different from some of the stories that you've ever read. It might tell you something that happened that was different from anything you've ever known. But it's just a different way of interpreting history from another point of view. At the same time, women were petitioning to get the right to vote. You know, the women's movement was in full swing in 1919. Okay? So there, if you wrote this from another point of view, from a young woman's point of view, that would have come out, the right to vote. And Mama did go to a meeting where they were talking about women voting. That's why I had Olive go there, because all of those issues were part of history, and I wanted to bring it out from another point of view.
Very good. We have another email, also from Katie Wilson's class at the King Center Charter School. Mm-hmm. In Color Me Dark, talk about a different point of view. Why didn't William come home at the times when the family needed him?
You know, in a family, you will always have those relatives who go away and seem to distance themselves from the family. We had such a person in my family, and I remembered that and brought it again into the story. We had an Uncle Arthur who left Alabama. This was part of my Alabama family. He left Alabama and went to Detroit, and he never went back home. He never went back south again. Something happened to him there that frightened him, or was such a turn-off for him, or such a horrible experience for him, that he chose never to go back again. And William was like, he just distanced himself from the family. It wasn't necessarily that he didn't love his family. He wrote to them and kept in contact, but he did not want to come back and be a part of that. It just wasn't, where he wanted to be. He found California.
Okay. We have another call from Bradford, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, we were wondering how many books you have written and which your favorite illustrator is that has illustrated your books.
Asking me which one of my books I love the most is like asking which one of my 3 sons I love the most. I really don't have one that I love more than the other. The one I'm working on is the one that gets my attention. And I'm working on something very exciting right now. I'm working on several books. I never work on one at a time. So I'm working on several books that have my attention, and of course that's where my joy comes from, working and researching and looking for new projects to work on all the time. Mm-hmm. Once a book is finished, I kind of move on. And right now, I think we're right at about a little over 100 books. Some of them have 27 words in them, and some of them are much longer and took us years to write.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from one of our studio audience. Please go ahead.
319 puzzles. How did you come up with those, or were you always good with numbers?
I'm terrible with numbers. Terrible with numbers, and my son helped me to do that. My engineering son helped me to do those, and he put a little. He used to play with numbers just that way. You know, and so he worked with the 1919 and putting these together to come up with these numbers and to play with numbers. He enjoys doing that, and so he gave me the idea, and I put it in the book. Okay. And I asked him to help me with the 19s.
We have time for one more question from the audience.
You know Reverend Prince? Yes. Was he modeled after somebody in your life? Or?
Yes. I have had several wonderful pastors that have pastored me in my faith journey, and he reminds me very much of a young pastor I had. In fact, he married my husband and me, and he was the pastor of Reverend Anderson, and he was the pastor of my church in Nashville.
That's really exciting.
Yeah. And he was open like that, and he got us to think beyond, just our little space. And he made the stories. And one of the most important things that I got at my church was that they took the Bible stories and made them into stories that we could relate to right now. And they took historical figures and put them in the Bible stories. For an example, they would tell the story, and then they would tell the story.
We've run out of time.
Oh, have we run out of time?
It's amazing, isn't it?
Already.
Many thanks to you, and many thanks to you for being with us today. Thanks to the studio, the students in the studio, and especially thanks to the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question today, you may contact us by using the email address on the screen. We'd love to hear from you and answer your questions. We'd also like to invite you to visit the Kennedy Center website at the addresses on the screen. There, you'll find additional information about the program and the Kennedy Center's upcoming programs, as well as other resources on integrating the arts into the curriculum. Please remember our next Kennedy Center program will be on Wednesday, April the 21st from 11 to 12 noon Eastern Time, when Dr. Billy Taylor will present Jazz and the New Generation. We hope you can join us. Thank you for being with us. Now, as you know, you mentioned in the Dark 30 that you were the president of a club in Tennessee that developed monster rules.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about those.
Monster rules. I think you all know them. When we were growing up, we were terrified of monsters. There was one I knew particularly who lived in my grandmother's chicken coop, and I wouldn't play near it because as the founder and first president of Monster Watchers of America, I had sent off for the starter kit, and I'd received 6 glow-in-the-dark ID badges and a monster manual. Inside the monster manual were 10 monster rules, and we had to know them all by heart so that you could survive any monster attack. So monster rule number 10 was never play near where monsters live. You know, if a monster lives and say, well, why would you play there? You've seen the movies where the house is saying, get out, and the people stay. Why? Then monster rule number 7, we all know that one. If you can get in the bed and cover up, you're safe. Monsters can't come through cover. However, if your arm drops across off the side of the bed at night, the monster underneath can whip you under the bed and you'll never be heard from again. Then there is monster rule number 3, never let a monster see you crying because it knows you're weak. But the prime directive is, if you are loved and you know you are loved, you are safe from all monsters. I knew my grandfather loved me, and therefore I was safe.